From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Israel agrees to a short-term ceasefire with Hamas in exchange for the release of some hostages, as more than 1,500 federal bureaucrats revolt against Joe Biden's policy in the region. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues at the editorial page, Elliot Kaufman and Kim Strassel. The exact details of the deal between Israel and Hamas are still coming in as we tape this on Wednesday, and some of them might be in the process yet of getting hammered out. But Elliot, can you give us a sense of the broad terms and what this means on the ground?
Sure. So the hostage deal is set to start Thursday morning, 10 a.m. The basic exchange here going on is that around 50 Israeli hostages, primarily children, their mothers, some other women, are being released in exchange for 4 days of a pause in Israeli military operations, as well as around 150 Palestinian terrorists, criminals who are in Israeli prisons and jails right now. That's the first phase of the deal. The second phase is that if Hamas gets its hands on more hostages that it suddenly finds, that's sort of how it talks about this. Really, it's just if it wants to release more hostages, it can provide another 10 in exchange for an additional day of pause. As well, Israel will be providing more fuel, humanitarian aid into Gaza. Hamas has agreed to allow Red Cross visits to the other remaining Israeli hostages. About 3/4 of them will remain. We'll see if it makes good on that one. There are a few other terms, and as you say, more are coming out, but that's the general picture.
Kim, one thing that I think is important here is that it seems to me this is another moment of moral clarity in terms of what each side is doing. So Hamas is going to release women and children that were taken over the border into Gaza and kidnapped. And in exchange, Israel is going to release what is described in the press as security prisoners. So there's a list of about 300 names that have been circulated. Some of the news reports say that that was published in order to give Israelis a chance to object in the country's judicial system if they think someone should not be released. But here's a line from the New York Times. It says all the names on the list were described as security prisoners or people who had been arrested in connection with politically motivated crimes. The offenses listed include supporting terrorism, acts of violence, and throwing stones. There are several charges of attempted murder. Most of those listed had not been convicted on the charges. And so, Kim, the basic details here seem to be is Hamas will release some mothers and toddlers, and Israel will release people who've been jailed for acts of violence, throwing stones and so forth. And I mean, I think that framing is something that's important for the world to acknowledge.
This is so important because you're not actually getting that framing if you watch a number of television outlets and news outlets. They would make it sound as though, Hamas is giving back women and children to Israel, and Israel is giving back women and children to Hamas. They're not the same thing. Hamas overran areas of Israel in a surprise attack, murdered, raped, tortured individuals, and then stole off with Israeli citizens and visitors, including Israeli children as young as 9 months. Those are some of the people Hamas is now giving back belatedly, versus Israel is being expected to release people who, as you say, were caught up for having engaged in acts of violence. No doubt some of those who are going to be released are going to be actual Hamas operatives who just happen to be female or under the age of 18. And yes, they do train them up and they do take part. Some people of which have gone through the judicial system have been adjudged of having broken the law. And it's just really, really important that everyone understand this. Add to this as well, too, how painful this must be for Israel because they know what happens in prisoner exchanges. The current Hamas leader in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar, was one of more more than 1,000 prisoners that Israel released in 2011 in exchange for one kidnapped Israeli soldier. And he, of course, went back and is now the architect of all this blood and devastation. So Israel must know that there could be future consequences from this prisoner release. But I think it says something really important, in addition to everything else about Israel, that it cares enough about its hostages that it's willing to do this to get them back.
Elliot, how much does that history, especially of this 2011 prisoner release, weigh on public opinion and feeling about whether this is a good deal for Israel to take now with Hamas?
It's a great question. I think every Israeli citizen, Israeli leader has that 2011 deal on the mind when they're thinking about this deal. Now, you can look at it two ways. In one sense, the terms of the deal have markedly improved. So in the 2011 deal, it was Israel gets one person, Hamas gets 1,027. And of those 1,000, 280 of them were serving life sentences for murders of Israelis. And many of those released went on to rejoin Hamas, commit more murders, plan more, including, as was said, Sinwar, who is the mastermind of the October 7th attack. This time, it's a 1-to-3 ratio in the exchange. And I think what that tells you is that Hamas really wants this pause in the fighting. The prisoners who are being released, most of them have committed what you could say are lower level crimes, although it's important to insist that some of them are in prison for stabbing Israelis in an attempt to commit murder, others in there for plotting suicide bombing. So not all of them are at that lower level. It's a better deal than 2011, but Israelis are very much attuned to the risks of this deal, that people will get out, commit more crimes, that Hamas will use the extra time to kill more Israeli soldiers, lay more ambushes. Israelis know all this, and yet they're going for the deal anyway. In many ways, they think they have no choice if they want to get their own citizens back alive. Israel is a kind of humane society that doesn't leave its people behind, and so that can be used against it. It gets put in these impossible situations, and it makes a deal.
Kim, it also seems that Hamas may try to extend this pause, maybe by claiming that Israel has not lived up to its terms, and so it needs something else, maybe by suggesting that it will dribble out more hostages for more days of pause. But it is notable that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is saying in no uncertain terms that this is not going to be the end of the fight in Gaza. Here's what he said, I think yesterday: "The war continues and will continue until we achieve all of our aims to destroy Hamas, to bring back all of the hostages, and to ensure that the day after Hamas, Gaza will no longer be a threat to Israel." Unquote. And so notable that he is saying that, though it's hard to predict what Hamas may try to do to change the situation on the ground in the next 4 days.
Yeah, it's good and reassuring to know that the Israeli leadership entirely understands the game here. And the game here is that Hamas is going to try to drag out this ceasefire and make it permanent. It essentially wants to use these hostages to end up in a scenario in which it was able to go in, engage in horrific acts of terrorism, and then nonetheless stop any Israeli attempt to come after it by holding these hostages out as leverage and turning these temporary pauses into a permanent ceasefire. And by the way, it's going to be relying heavily on the international community to continue its unwarranted pressure on Israel to engage in a ceasefire. And that is one of the risks that Israel faces. It faces, as you know, Kyle, the worry that Hamas is going to engage in tricks, whether it's dribbling out fewer hostages each day, or whether it's stopping in the middle of this process or a day in, somehow claiming Israel reneged on the deal, and then stalling another day, another two, again, anything to make this longer and hope it turns permanent. But Israel, at least, this is an old enemy of Israel's. They're very much aware of the kind of shenanigans or tricks that Hamas would try to get up to. And what's notable about this deal to me is that A lot of that thought seems to have gone into this, and there's it seems, broad awareness of what could go wrong and contingency plans for what's going to happen if that's the case.
Elliot, how do you think this 4-day pause might affect the strategic situation on the ground? There have been some suggestions that the deal will include limitations on the Israeli Air Force's ability to fly over areas of Gaza. And it will also involve bringing in more supplies and aid. And some of that might be intended or marked as humanitarian aid, though, as we've already seen, it is not hard to imagine that it will end up diverted to Hamas's purposes anyway.
So both sides have hopes for how they will use this pause. More fuel coming into the territory. It's my view that Hamas will get its hands on some of that fuel, which is crucial for it to continue operating in its underground tunnels, which is the only way that it really stays alive to continue the fight against Israel. So that's a huge deal right there. The limits to Israeli reconnaissance are real, are part of the deal. We'll see how effective those limits are. It's also the case, though, that Israel will be receiving some hostages back who may have information. We'll see if there's any useful information there. If Hamas does, in fact, allow Red Cross visits to the other remaining hostages, Israel may try to follow them and see where that leads. So both sides have some hopes in that sense. Now, the pause comes at a sort of pivotal moment in the Israeli counter-offensive. Israel is now the dominant presence with control over northern Gaza. It's now at the moment where it's time to turn south. But there are a lot of difficult questions because the civilians from the north were sent south. So where will they be sent now? Israel has to figure that out. There's a lot of serious planning. The U.S. actually wanted Israel to pause anyway to figure out that planning. So it's possible that this timing could be useful to Israel in that regard. It's also worth remembering that, this is now more than a week ago, but the U.S. had wanted Israel to agree to a humanitarian pause in the fighting in exchange for nothing from Hamas. And it was Israel that insisted, we're not going to pause unless we get some substantial number of hostages back. And now that this deal is in place, it looks like that particular decision has been borne out. One last thing I would say, people want to ask, was this a good deal, a bad deal for Israel? The answer is, it's too soon to say. We're going to see how Israel and the U.S. as well play this over the next 4 days, over the next week. And if Hamas is able to drag this out, divide Israel, get U.S. pressure on Israel, and really change the situation, we may look back at the deal and say, Israel just signed an agreement to allow Hamas to survive in some form. But if Israel holds firm, the U.S. holds firm, we'll look back and say, it was a great deal. Israel got many of its hostages out and continued with its other main objective, destroying Hamas.